This is Thrive Perspectives, an ever-growing discussion about the issues and ideas that shape our lives, with your guide, Dr. Matthew Jacoby.
Good to be back in the studio doing Perspectives, episode 2 after a little bit of a break. And great to have our good friend Connell with us again, Matt. G'day, Connell.
G'day, Stuart.
It's good to have you back on the team here, and we're going to be picking up our conversation around worldview. And
where did we get to, Stu?
Yeah, well, where did we get to, Matt? So I think probably one of the key things to go back over is just to really highlight the diagram that we were using to illustrate some of the points that we were trying to talk about last time. So, listeners, if you haven't caught episode 1 yet of this Worldview series, I'd really encourage you to jump back, have a listen to that. That's going to really inform where the conversation goes moving forward. But we talked about the axes. We talked about essentially a horizontal line. So, listeners, draw on a piece of paper a horizontal line and then a vertical line intersecting that. So you essentially have a big plus sign on your piece of paper. On the left-hand end of the horizontal line, we used the word pain. On the right-hand end of the horizontal line, we used the word pleasure. And at the top of the vertical line, we used the word sacred. And at the bottom of the vertical line, we used the word profane.
And there are a whole lot of other words that you could associate
use, exactly.
with those words.
So good, bad, however you want to use those words. But essentially what we're trying to illustrate there is the two axes. And really what we were saying is for Western culture, largely we live on this horizontal axis only.
Yep.
Where we're essentially seeing the purpose of life is to move from pain to pleasure, to move from having to have a full-time job to not having to work at all and be retired and, on my sailing boat and living the life of luxury, or however you want to define that. But we spend a lot of our time, and yet we miss out on so much because we don't engage with the invitation that there is on this vertical line with the sacred. And in fact, I think, Matt, you spoke a bit about also the reason we've perhaps eliminated this vertical line is because we're trying to eliminate those things below the horizontal,
right,
the profane, the painful, the profane and the things that disgust and the shame and all those sorts of things. And so the way to eliminate that is to also eliminate...
Just get rid of the whole
line.
Element of reality.
Exactly
and I think that's probably where the diagram is useful. And again, the diagram is a tool.
Yes.
But the idea is to create a little bit of a map of reality, to push against essentially a flattening of reality in our culture, to recognize that there's another whole dimension to reality that our culture tends not to acknowledge, but which we are actually wired for. And so the horizontal axis depicts that flattening, I guess, with that on its own. That we live, as you said, we live life on this trajectory between pain and pleasure. But yet, even if we're moving, in a satisfactory way along that horizontal axis towards pleasure, you can attain that and yet be left feeling empty because we're wired for more than that. There's a whole other dimension of reality that I've tried to depict using that vertical axis, because there's these elements of the sacred and the sublime and the glorious things associated with this transcendent realm, with the fact that we are people created in the image of God. There's this whole other aspect of reality. It's where a sense of transcendent purpose sits, and of course at the bottom of that vertical axis lies experiences which essentially go the opposite to that. So as you said, take a word like defilement. In our culture, even the concept of that is a bit countercultural now. We don't want to even think of that, so we just get rid of the whole aspect of reality. But there is a sense in which something sacred can be desecrated, and we do experience that. Actually, we do in our experience. We have these feelings of desecration that don't really get validated in our culture. So even though you may not believe in that whole other dimension, yet in various ways, we still, in sort of veiled senses, we still experience the things on that vertical axis.
And interestingly, I think you said last time too, most other, bit of a generalization there, but let's say most other indigenous cultures around the world still actually put a lot of value in a vertical axis.
Well,
of some
actually,
form,
I'd say every other culture apart from a sort of post-Enlightenment, let's call it broadly speaking, European culture, hold to this. We're the only ones that live in this secular space. Very important philosophical work from sort of the last 20 years is Charles Taylor's A Secular Age. Charles Taylor is a Catholic philosopher, very influential philosopher, but he's done a really amazing analysis of the way of thinking of our particular secular age, showing how it's different from every other time, and even in our time, every other place, every other culture, and showing what's distinctive about it, and even in a sense what's kind of dysfunctional about it as well. And he depicts, he talks about people living, and the language that he uses is in this immanent frame. We only accept the reality that's available to our senses, and in some ways available to our logical analysis in some sense, that there's no reality, beyond that. And so it's a, flattening of that reality. And he also talks about us living in a buffered relationship with our, with reality. So in order to do that, in order for reality to be the object of our analysis, therefore we have to have this buffered relationship to it. We're not, and he contrasts that to a porous relationship with reality that, that he sees it, probably before, say, 500 years ago, even in a European culture, that was the way people would never have even thought about even questioning whether there was a spiritual realm and God and so forth. It wouldn't have even occurred to them to question that. And indeed, in most other cultures, that's still the case. But with this buffered relationship through the Enlightenment period, and this drawing back and trying to reduce reality to what we can sort of access with our senses and our intellect, has created this, essentially this flattening of our world. And it's what, and another book that I think alluded to in the last episode, if I remember rightly, is actually the novel Flatland by Edwin Abbott. And, where he parodies essentially and that's late 19th century. He even saw that happening then as the flattening of our reality. And so he tells this story about, these characters are sort of two-dimensional figures, two-dimensional, like squares and triangles and circles. That's right. And so, and then, the lead character has this encounter with a sphere, and it's a very clever way of picturing really what has gone wrong, that we've lost touch with a whole other dimension of reality, for which we are, and I'll say it again, for which we are very much wired. We're wired for that, and that's been recognised in a number of ways in psychology and so forth. So,
great recap, Matt. Conal, did you have any reflections from before we sort of jump into taking it the next stage? And it'd be good to move forward on that. But was there anything else that you kind of wanted to reflect on from our last convo?
Well, I think Matt's intro there was a good summary, and I think for a lot of Christians sort of listening, you might be thinking, well, I'm a Christian, obviously I'm not part of that, way of thinking of just that one-dimensional. I do have the spiritual aspect in my life, and therefore, you're not really speaking to me, you're speaking to those who are outside of the church. And so, but I think this is where we really want to get to today, and I think where we're going to lead into is, why should I actually care as a Christian? Because I think all of those things have impacted us as Christians as well, not even just as individuals, but even within the church, in terms of that one-dimensional way of thinking, even that sort of relying on the fact that we have to be able to rationalize everything in order to be able to prove that it's true. The experience has to be very tangible, very present, something that I can actually comprehend.
Yeah, so in other words, even for a lot of Christians now, and this is partly why I emphasize this to Christians, is because I think a lot of Christians can live on that flat axis and not really recognize, because again, the cultural pressure has this flattening effect on our experience. And so a valid ideas and a valid experience means a tangible experience in some sense, and valid ideas means something that I can logically grasp.
Yes, that's right. And something too that I think even seems intellectually reasonable or understandable. It's got to fit inside my brain.
Yeah.
So my whole experience with God or church has to be something that I can tangibly sort of wrap my head around and be able to understand it logically as being reason. And therefore, I think it's a reflection of just the world.
Yeah.
Because that's where we all come from.
Yeah.
And we like to understand everything.
Yeah, it's a great point.
And that comes back to my point about, the way that we reflect on, understand the truth. Truth is not the object of my reflection as such, because that puts me somehow on the outside. Like you said, we're trying to constantly fit it into our ways of thinking.
Yeah.
Whereas it's actually, we need to fit in with it. It's what in philosophy you talk about an existential position, like how we relating to reality as though we were on the outside looking in. Mm-hmm. That's that experience where you feel like you're sort of constantly outside your own life. We're invited to actually step inside that truth rather than it fit into our minds. Yeah. We're invited to put our lives into the truth in a very constant and experiential way, but with a real constancy to it. That even the way that we think and reflect, and we do so from the inside rather than from the outside looking in, which is, I think, one of the big problems with a lot of people these days that I have conversations with. Connell, and you'd be the same. It's like we're constantly, and I think probably we're all similar in this way, is that you just feel like you want to think your way into the truth.
Yeah. Yeah.
and the funny thing is, in doing that, you end up further away, because that I'm going to think about it like it's an intellectual object for my reflection. Already that's a false situation. So the more you do that, the more, in a sense, you buffer yourself from the very thing that essentially you can only really know from the inside.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
That's great.
And I think I naturally want to, and I think it's probably true for the three of us, I like thinking these things through. And I often do put myself outside of the picture to try to think about what does it actually look like, looking at it differently to how I would normally think. I'm always after another idea that I can grab hold of that changes how I think about things. So I think naturally, certainly the three of us enjoy just thinking about these things just purely for the sake of thinking about them and what it actually kind of what kind of comes out of that thinking and so on. So I think we're drawn to it, but I know that for a lot of people who would be listening and a lot of Christians, they're not drawn to those things. They kind of listen to it and go, oh yeah, that's interesting, that would explain that. And then when they walk out the door, it's like
great point.
Life goes on as normal. And I think the really key thing that I think we've got to try to do over however many episodes this goes for is answer the question of ultimately, but so what?
Yeah,
to the average person who isn't excited by big ideas and worldviews and so on. What does it mean for them?
Yeah, and
day by day?
I think that's really important, Connell, and it is one of the things we talked about pre-podcast that we really want to make sure. It's going to seem like there's a lot of kind of thinking going on here.
You're not telling me I have to be practical.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to.
Come on, guys.
But I think
you're pushing it a bit.
Yeah,
there.
that's right. I think genuinely though, there is an element where you have to be able to identify the problem before you can actually start to work on a solution. And I think part of the first couple of episodes here is we're actually just trying to paint the picture of the problem. And but listeners, stick with us. We will, over this series, I think we will be able to land some really practical ways that we can start to find ourselves on that vertical axis and taking up the invitation that's there, to to connect in with that vertical axis.
Yeah,
But it is about identifying
yeah.
what the problem is first, I think.
Yeah, and it raises the question, how do you actually,
Yeah.
how do you broaden your worldview? It's actually not just a matter of just thinking, changing the way that you think. You've got to habituate yourself through, you've got to be doing things that are constantly stretching elasticizing your imagination, and also habituating yourself to a different way of knowing. So there actually is some very practical.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it is practical.
Well, I think they're potentially life-changing. And
Yeah.
I think this is why people should stick with it. Even if you kind of think, interesting ideas, but what is it? How do I actually put this into practice? It's not even, it's how do I put it into practice, but it's not just about how to put it into practice. It's actually these things I think that we're talking about that are almost like keys that unlock what I would consider big ideas that are actually life-changing. That if you can take them on board and properly understand what it is that they're saying and where they kind of lead your thinking and how you view the world, if you take them on board, they are life-changing. And I know since you first introduced me to this idea, Matt, it's constantly turning over in my mind and different ideas kind of pop out at me. You just go, well, actually, that would explain this and explain that, and it actually highlights to me, where maybe I go wrong in my own thinking, or to appreciate things that are going on around me, which we can talk about as to how some of these ideas can help.
That's great.
Transform just how we actually engage and interact in the world. So
I think it's great. And you know, the word worldview really is saying the lens through which we look at all of these things. You know, it's like we can either look through just normal glasses or we can look through 3D glasses. And, you know, as probably a poor
that's good.
analogy,
like
but it gives us one. And I think that's what we're doing, because it's not then about thinking, it's about seeing things differently. It's not about thinking necessarily differently, but if you see it differently, it reshapes your thinking, and I think that's probably where we want to head.
I went to watch Avatar actually in 3D, and I took at regular points. I'm curious, so I take the glasses off to see what it looks like, and they have this double, because then suddenly it flattens, and so they have this double, and it just doesn't. It becomes an incoherent image largely, and I think that's a good illustration, Stu, because I think God wants us to live with our sort of existential 3D glasses, with an ability actually to see reality in 3 dimensions, so to speak, or 4 dimensions, or however what you want to put it. And again, speaking about, you know, when I'm talking about dimensions, talking analogically, but maybe that's a good way to put this. So we certainly want to.
And I actually love
that.
You know, the fact you just said about taking the glasses off, because what we think actually looks okay, we've just got used to it looking okay with our normal glasses on.
Yeah,
we got used to that because we just haven't put our 3D glasses on to go, oh man, that looks terrible now. And it's not until we do, and then we take them off and we look again, we go, oh man, I've been missing so much. I think that's
right.
A great little illustration.
And
you just gave us there.
I'm going to use that, Stu, next sermon.
Okay.
That illustration's come out.
Yeah,
watch this space. This is good. I'm going to do my sermon prep right here, inductively.
We should kick into this episode, Matt. Where are we going to go? Where are we going to go today?
I thought we'd work with that diagram. So I think it would be good for our listeners to picture that, maybe even draw it on a piece of paper.
Great idea.
We'll put something on.
Yeah, we will, Matt. I think what we might do, listeners, is we'll film a short video of Matt explaining the diagram, and it'll be the 2 axes plus some things we're going to talk about today.
Yeah.
And we'll make sure that that's up on our website for you to access in the next week. So check that out, thrivetoday.tv, and we'll make sure that that's up.
So we want to actually talk about how that model actually opens up elements of experience, actually real life experience, perhaps even experience on the extremes. And so picturing that double axis, again, it's a cross with, you know, sacred and all of the things associated with that, the sublime, the glorious, and so forth up the top, you know, at the bottom of the vertical axis, you know, those experiences of a sense of desecration, you know, shame, sense of, the profane at the bottom. And again, the pain and the pleasure. So I want to divide that into 4 bits. Quadrants. Then if you imagine the cross, and there are essentially 4 quadrants within that. And I want to speak first to the sort of the top right hand, that space between pleasure on the one hand and the sacred. There is a real connection between pleasure and I think we've done with pleasure is we've flattened pleasure down. It's become very much about satisfying impulses, essentially natural impulses and appetites. And that's, in a sense, where what we've associated with pleasure. But there's this element of pleasure, and certainly this is validating the fact, in what people actually do for pleasure. They inevitably looking for something that has an elevating effect in some sense, even though this is not acknowledged in our culture. There is this association with this connection between the sacred, because ultimately what gives us, the way that we're wired as spiritual beings, what gives us the most pleasure is ultimately what is most sacred. And so again, we're wired for that connection with what is most sacred, and even what is sacred in each other. So, we can draw immense pleasure from relationships. I mean, this is ultimately our relationship with God, because God is the one who is most sublime and glorious, and so there is this sense in which our ultimate pleasure is in God. Now, that's a bit of a cliche for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Sometimes when you say that, I mean, I can feel it. I'll say that in the context of preaching or something, and I can almost feel the irritation. It's like, what does that mean? To have pleasure in God, such an abstract idea.
Well, people say it as you say, it's used a lot, but we just don't individually feel anything around that. It's like,
Well, I don't think pleasure is a good word, because pleasure to me could mean
because of the association of the flat axis.
And it's almost like a feeling that I'm seeking, like I'm actually engaging in something that gives me pleasure. But I think pleasure could be just pursuit of something that is satisfying, whether it's feeling satisfied in what I'm doing in my life. I'm being able to achieve the things that, there's got pleasure, you've got other words like joy, happiness, things like that. It's not necessarily an activity, but it could be a state of well-being.
Yeah.
You're trying to chase a state of well-being rather than a state of being in pain and suffering.
And this is where those words are interchangeable, and I think we've just chosen to use. I totally get your point, and it is difficult because, as you said, Matt, this also changes the meaning of words. But
that's
you've got
right.
to pick something to go with.
That's right. I think C.S. Lewis's illustration about the sun, he talks about we don't really look at the sun. You can't look at the sun directly, but by the light of the sun, we see everything. So in a way, we see the reflection of the sun almost in everything.
Yeah.
And I think this in a way, practically speaking, is how we experience God. It's not that we encounter an object, because this is the problem. You talk about taking pleasure in God, and suddenly people flatten that to an experience of some kind of tangible encounter with an object, right? Now, God is not an object. The being of God, undergirds all, everything else. God is present and at work in everything. God transcends everything. But there's a sense in that illustration that the reflection of God is in everything around us constantly. The goodness of God is in everything. The power of God is at work constantly in all things. It's actually the very constancy of the presence and the power of God in all things that causes us actually not to perhaps sense or be aware of that. And there's a sense in which we can take pleasure in all things in that multidimensional sense, you know what I mean? So it's not that we aren't pursuing God in and of himself. It's not that it's always mediated through the experience of other things. But there's a sense in which every other thing, including every other relationship, has this sacramental quality, and by that I mean that it is the outstretched hand of God in some sense. By sacrament, I mean like communion.
Yep.
It's a physical thing that says something to us. It's God is communicating something through it. So everything in the world has, in some sense, a sacramental quality. God is speaking to us, reaching out to us all. Now, it's not that those things are God. This is not pantheism that I'm advocating here. And this is where sometimes Christians can veer away from these ideas because, that sounds a bit like, Brahman or pantheistic ideas. And so we pendulum swing away from actually elements of truth in that, because the fact is God sustains and upholds and is at work in all things all the time and so forth. Okay, so let's not move away. Let's not reduce God to, a discrete being somewhere in the universe that we need to experience tangibly. So there's a sense in which it's the very pervasiveness of the presence of God that causes us perhaps that idea to be a little bit elusive for us. But I think this is where that experience of pleasure in God can actually be something possible, because God is actually, in a sacramental sense, communicating with us all the time through everything.
Yeah. So, and I think that's the problem with when we look at the word pleasure on that single axis, is that we kind of reduce it down to an experience as distinct from the pain experience. But I think what we get when we introduce the vertical axis is that it does stretch out another dimension in that, which is almost that once you kind of see that sacred dimension, that pleasure and pain, like pain can be satisfying in a sense of well-being when you're actually experiencing some kind of, when you're connected to the sacredness.
That's right.
God.
Well, here's a great example of that, Connell, and we're moving over to the left hand, which is fine. Which let's just briefly refer to that. So if you go on the other side of the vertical line, in that space between pain and the sacred and the sublime and so forth.
So top left-hand quadrant.
Top left-hand quadrant. I mean, I've lately, for some reason, been watching lots of mountain climbing films, documentaries, and I'm amazed at the amount of pain that these people go through to attain a sense and experience of the sublime. And mountains in the human psyche have been associated with this experience of almost a sense of sacredness, and there's something there. There's something about what people will the painful experiences they will go through to bring about some kind of experience of elevation. It's almost an experience of sacrifice. They're sacrificing so much because they're looking for something more, and it is actually a search for the sublime. And so. I think that's a profound statement. It's where, almost in a veiled sense, you see people going after something sublime without really knowing, what they're doing. And yet, when they describe it back, even that, that being on the edge of death itself, and the how alive they feel, and it's all in a sort of slightly garbled way. It looks like a search for the sublime, essentially.
Yeah. Well, you've even got Paul in prison. I'm sure he was in a place of enjoying.
No. He was in a Roman prison. It's not a nice place to be, but
he was connected to God.
That's right. Because there was an immense sense of sacrifice. It was emptying him out. It left him in this state of. It just demolished him in some sense, because he goes through awful things. But there's almost this sense he talks about in very similar ways to what a mountain, although in different words and much more coherently, because of course he's aware of the process by which this is actually drawing him closer to God, and in his emptiness and being stripped away, it's this state of porousness, to use a term I used before.
But that's where his sense of he probably felt well-being, because he's actually in the hand of God.
Yeah.
As opposed, he wasn't feeling pleasure. He was feeling pain, but he was still feeling. I would say in an elevated sense, there is a sense of pleasure in that. And this is the thing that there's this whole other dimension to pleasure. It draws it
in the
out.
same way. It's like, why do people go climbing these mountains? Because through all the pain, there is this elevated form of pleasure that comes about.
But can I say, in both of those examples, there's an ultimate goal that they both know.
Yeah.
Now, if you don't have that ultimate goal, if it's just getting from pain to pleasure,
yeah,
then pain is not worth putting up with. It's just the opposite of pleasure. No one's going to climb a mountain without knowing when they get to the top, assuming they're going to get to the top, and that's their goal. They're going to experience the sublime. Paul, you know, in his context, if he hadn't known Christ and known what it was that he was suffering for, he wouldn't have been feeling the pleasure in that pain either.
Yeah.
And so I think it's this whole sense of, it's only when we've got this elevated sense of understanding that pain can then make sense, as you said, where actually it's about sacrifice because of the ultimate sublime in the sacred when we get there. So
yeah, that's right.
It's great.
I think practically one of the key things in that top right-hand space between the, you know, pleasure and the sacred and elevating experiences of pleasure is the discipline, I'm going to talk about as a discipline of recovering contemplative spaces.
Yeah, great.
Because we live at such a fast pace today that we only really have time to satisfy essentially impulses. I'm hungry, I eat. That immediate accessible pleasures. And even the sort of media that we watch becomes shorter and shorter for media because we just, you know, we want to be satisfied.
Want a quick hit.
A very, very quick hit.
Yep.
So we're really into quick hit
Yep.
pleasure. But the thing about the sacred and the sublime is that it demands open space. It demands a sort of sacred space in our timeline, in our schedule.
It's almost like you've got to stop.
Stop
trying
that's right.
to you keep jumping all the time between pain and pleasure. It's almost like you've got to...
Well, you're racing up that, you know, I mean, I think everyone's trying to race almost blindly up that along that horizontal axis toward pleasure, and yet you're left feeling empty. But part of the problem is the lack of contemplative space. And it's not just space in time, it's actually mental space, because we're so... because we're living at the level of impulse constantly and the quick hit thing, we're so overstimulated and we're almost addicted to the quick hit pleasure in its various forms. There are many different forms. And so the idea of creating contemplative space is to move beyond impulse, beyond quick hit pleasure, to something more elevated and sublime.
You can see the problem here, though, that if you've only got that one dimension, you're always going to feel like you're not quite satisfied, or you're not where you want to be. So it's almost like you're running against like a piece of elastic tied to pain that keeps pulling you back, and all of your energy goes into trying to move towards the pleasure side.
Yeah.
And if that's all that you see, your whole life is pulling against that piece of elastic that's trying to keep pulling you back towards pain. And what you've really got to do is, it's almost like you've got to cut the elastic cord that keeps pulling you back and allow yourself to be wherever you are on that line.
Good point.
Not pursue the pleasure, not necessarily run away from pain and not pursue pleasure. It's accepting where you are now, and then allowing yourself to
actually, and I would add to that, Connell, accepting where you are even on the vertical axis, because one of the reasons I think that people avoid contemplative spaces is because we always begin below the line.
Yeah.
I mean, all have sinned and fallen short
Great
of the
point.
glory of God, right? So, because the first step really is allowing ourselves to see where there's been a desecration of something sacred, and actually to allow ourselves to feel that. Because this is the reason why in the first place we get rid of that whole vertical axis, is because we're trying to avoid an experience of guilt, of shame, of sense of desecration. But actually we need to face the fact that something sacred, and that's essentially the desecration. Sin is a
form of desecration.
Desecration of something sacred, right? The fact something being sacred means you can't do whatever you want with it, right? And essentially the problem with humanity is that we've broken away from God and we've just treated this sacred thing that we are. We've essentially desecrated this because we were created for worship, for something sacred, and we ourselves are infinitely sacred. So,
Matt, that's such a great. That's such a great point. When we say beginning to try to create this contemplative space, it doesn't feel great to start with because we realise how far we are. But we've got to I'm guessing this is where you're going. We've got to push through, because if we just go on how we feel the first few times, we're going to give up before we even begin and get above the horizontal line.
That's right. And if we don't allow ourselves to feel the kind of pain, and we're talking three-dimensionally now, the pain that's down that, the pain of how we've failed and fallen short, and that the pain even of that sense of desecration. That is where we meet Jesus. That's where salvation happens, right? That's where our transformation happens. If you want to climb a ladder, you don't start in the middle rung, you start in the bottom rung. And the bottom rung of the ladder that leads to our elevation is down there in that place of humility, of penitence. This is so biblical. It's like those who sow in tears, Psalm 126, those who sow in tears will reap with songs of joy. So there's something, we've got to face reality before we can attain truth, and the reality is that we have all fallen short. And I think it's the avoidance of that in a sense shuts us out from an experience of elevation, because we have pursued pleasure, or all of us have pursued pleasure in ways, and this is now going to the bottom right-hand quadrant essentially, is that we have pursued pleasure in ways that have essentially desecrated, had this effect of desecration, and we need to actually allow ourselves to feel that pain and meet Jesus in that place and find forgiveness. For you don't deal with that pain of guilt just by saying, "Oh, there's nothing to be guilty about," which is the way that our culture, since roughly since the time of Sigmund Freud and so forth, that's how he dealt. Faced with all these clients that came with these sense of shame and he was, you got nothing to be. He just got rid of the whole vertical axis. We'll just get rid of that. Well, that's ridiculous, because we're wired for that. So no, rather what we do is that's where we encounter Jesus, and that's where we begin our journey. And it's, in a sense, contemplative spaces. For me, contemplative spaces often bring me back to my failure. But for me, as a Christian, it's safe to face my failure, because that's where I encounter the grace of God. That's where I get lifted up. Those who humble themselves will be lifted up, is the consistent theme in Scripture.
I'm just thinking, like, a lot of us will probably start our Christian journey in that becoming aware of our need for God and our sin. And that's kind of like the entry point really into that. And we begin our journey coming from the bottom, traveling up that vertical axis. But I'm just wondering there as well, a lot of us probably get stuck as we go up that axis, because we end up then thinking, okay, now we've got to that, we've kind of got to first base, and then God becomes just another vehicle for achieving what we've called pleasure. Maybe it's not pleasure, but well-being. God is necessary to give me meaning and purpose in life,
to prosperity and all that kind of stuff,
and so on. So I kind of stop at that level, and God then becomes that just another thing that I then retransform the whole idea of God back into that horizontal axis. And it's a means then to keep the struggle on again, to get back to, he gives meaning to me in my life and so on. But is the outcome I'm seeking there well-being for myself, or like, have I stopped at that level, or is it I should be pushing up further, is where I'm trying to get to there, that there's actually something beyond that's pushing towards the pursuit of the sacred, getting, pushing in closer to God, because I want to be closer to God and I want to be part of the sacred space where he is, rather than my own. And even if it means I'm in pain, that's where I want to be, irrespective of pleasure or pain.
And often it can take painful experiences to take us back to where we need to be. I think it's important just to respond to what you're saying. It's, again, let's remember the limitations of the diagram. The diagram's just a tool. This is where the complexity is, because the more sensitive, in my experience, the more sensitive I become to that vertical axis, to the things of God, to sacredness, and the more my conscience softens and softens and softens and become more and more sensitive. Now, what this means is that I'm constantly realizing actually the things even in myself. I'm finding new depths of way, and I know this, and this is where it's so countercultural, because I'm finding new ways in which I've got it all wrong. in which I've gone wrong, essentially. And our culture would say, oh, no, that's you're fine, you're good, But no, actually, in my worldview, it's actually the key is actually facing those elements. So when the onion gets peeled back, as I become more sensitive, and I realize those elements in myself that are restricting, and because in a sense there are things in us all that want to constantly close reality down, right? Because we have this God complex, so we want to be in mastery over reality. So we have to create a small enough reality over which we can feel like we're in control, right? Which is why we create these small realities that we can grasp intellectually and then grasp through our senses, because it's a kind of God complex. It's why we make reality into an object. It's not just a mistake. It's not just an intellectual mistake. Yeah. It's a highly motivated aspect of human nature that goes right back to the original temptation, which is to be like God. We suffer from a God complex. And so, we're constantly wanting to, and this is why even, we can treat God as a means to an end because we can sort of return back to that God complex so easily.
I think we go through stages or phases where we become sensitive to God and to the sacred and what He's saying to us, and we become more, and then we try to retake control again.
Yeah,
and I think that's where we stop trying to get up there. We actually lose that. I think the word there you said was sensitive to the sacred, and I think for a lot of Christians, like we live our lives and we go through the process, but it becomes dry.
Yeah.
And it becomes I'm a Christian, that's how I live my life. I'm in certain patterns and processes, and I think a certain way as a result of it. Where is God, though, in that? How sensitive am I to all? And it's almost like that sacred, it kind of starts to dull.
Yeah.
And then we just continue to live on that horizontal again. And I think that's where, we kind of hit a point and we retake control. And then it becomes, again, a thing of we're back and forth between pain and pleasure. And we need to get sensitive.
And I think part of that, and I know this is for me anyway, I know part of that, and this has been a bit of a journey for me over the last 10, 15 years, is that in our Christian faith, we tend to, I've been forgiven, it's all okay, and we minimize the sin in our lives that happens, that we commit every single day, and we don't feel the weight of that sin anymore because we kind of been told by our Western culture, oh, you're forgiven, it's all good, move on, nothing to see here, when actually I feel like we need to feel the weight of that more. We actually need to feel the sorrow of God, even though He loves us still and we are forgiven, the sorrow of God, when we because that's what creates a sensitivity to continuing to aspire up the vertical, and the minute we try to dull that down, that sense of I feel this cost, this pain, the easier it is for us to stop at the horizontal and keep moving along because it's all dealt with, it's fine, move along. But in fact, when we feel the weight of our sin, you suddenly feel the draw up.
I'm always chasing, I still am chasing pleasure. I still am playing on that horizontal.
Which we can't. We're made for elevated pleasure. We're made for that actually.
Yeah.
And so, this is the thing. We everyone madly pursues pleasure in those physical forms because I think they're not recognizing that actually, yes, we are made for pleasure, but we're made for elevated forms of, and that's not. And it's not that it's not those forms of pleasure. The pleasure of having even a really lovely meal or something. That's part of God's creation. This is what I'm saying. It's recognizing the whole other dimension, that sacramental quality. It's why traditionally meals have been associated with Thanksgiving. Because a meal traditionally is been associated with pleasure. And so there's a sense in which let's recognize the other dimension of this. Let's recognize that as we experience the goodness of this food, that we're also experiencing the goodness of God. Let's open up. Let's open this experience up and have a bigger experience than just a physical experience.
I think that's the problem. That's the problem that I have. Sometimes I like to watch YouTube and I watch video after video after video, trying to get those quick hits of pleasure. And I can tell you now that in my head, I do have the battle going on. Do I watch another YouTube video or do I spend some time maybe trying to get into a more contemplative space and sort of sit with God? And 9 out of 10 times, the next YouTube video wins. Yep. You know.
Oh, those short reels, you know, those little reels like, oh, what's this? What? You know.
And so I will chase that quick hit of pleasure again and preference that over seeking a more, seeking God and that and that's what I mean. I think we start to fill up a lot. We go through these phases where we are sensitive to God and seeking, and then we kind of drop back into this quick hit looking for pleasure, when I think what we really want to do, and this is the power of this model that we're talking about, none of that makes sense unless we can kind of grab hold of it and stretch it out into another dimension and realize that those things in themselves will never, the end result of that isn't the pleasure that we're seeking.
Yeah.
It's only from when we're looking at it from the top down and seeing it from that other dimension, that all those things actually make sense. But I don't think we're creating enough space in our lives, and it comes back to seeking and contemplation, and that's why we need to see that vertical axis so that we know that that's, well, it's like an invitation.
Yeah,
that's another
although there's
way
a lot of people
that
will and this is what I mean, it's what people have actually said to me as I've talked about this. So because there's a sense almost of frustration of, when you talk about, because in church circles we talk about seeking God and spending time with God. Actually, I think there's a step before that, actually, and I've realized this increasingly, because spending time with God, it's just like, I can't. Straight away, they're looking for something experiential and tangible.
It's like we're striving.
Yeah, so that's right. So what I've actually been saying is that, because the first step essentially is to learn actually to not be stimulated, to learn actually to inhabit an empty space. That, I think, is one of the most important disciplines. It's partly why, at church in the first Monday night of every month, we have this what we call the waiting room, where we invite people to come and sit in silence for an hour, because and a lot of, it's interesting, the responses to the people, I didn't really experience anything. No, but that's not even the point. Actually, the point is just the discipline of creating an open space in time where you just sit and do nothing, because we have lost the ability to do. That is absolutely crucial. I had some surgery recently, and so I've had to spend a lot of time immobile, essentially. And I thought to myself, okay, I'm not going to sit around watching TV all day. That's the easy option. I'm really going to.
How'd that go, man? How'd that go?
Well, actually, actually, the World Cup was on, so I did watch. I did watch copious amounts of football. But actually, I had lots of time, and I was pretty deliberate. And this is the thing about being conscious about how am I going to use that time? Because I could easily fill it with just switching on the telly and watching, or sitting on my phone and watching reels or whatever, which is immensely tempting. You know what I mean? You can just pick up your phone, can, by the time you just watch, 1,000 reels in like 5 minutes.
If you want no greater evidence of how distracted and pleasure seeking we are, it's just think about how many times you pick up the phone just to see if there's another message or another video or something else that you haven't seen before.
Yeah, that's right.
It's just this constant, anyway.
Yeah, that's right. And so, I even just sitting at the table with a cup of tea, like sitting outside on the deck and just drinking my cup of tea and just looking at my dog sleeping in the sun, just nothing, but just making the choice. I'm actually not going to do anything. I'm just going to sit here and inhabit this space and just learn to be present. Just notice, look at the garden, feel the warmth of the, just sit and do nothing. Yeah. That actually is a step, I think, before, prayer and trying to, do, and I'm not saying don't pray. It's actually our
begin where you are.
Yeah, it's begin where you are and learn to inhabit space.
So, but I think a lot of ways when we do force ourselves to go, I need to go and pray, I need to set aside this time, there's a sense of striving that comes with it that says, right, I'm going to do this. And it's almost like I expect to get something out of it.
Yeah.
And if I don't get something out of it, then I'm disappointed. And I think, I didn't really kind of feel it. And it might be discouraging then I think we do go through phases. We go, I'm really going to get my prayer life in order. I'm going to spend more time on it. And it starts off like a New Year's resolution. And then before you know it, you kind of step down and then it just falls away again. And I think what you're saying is it's actually really liberating. Is like, just stop the striving, just enjoy the world that God has put you in. So an example is, like even when you go for a walk, just go for a walk, take the headphones out, stop listening to music, stop looking for stimulation, and just be stimulated by the fact that you can hear the birds, or you can see the wind blowing through the trees, or the warmth of the sun, and enjoy it for once. And
I think it helps us to understand why the fourth commandment, 1 out of 10 commandments, is stop, work 6 days, 1 day a week, do nothing, like just rest, And there's a contemplative, that has a contemplative association because, of course, when it talks about God rested on the seventh and he saw that all that he made and it was very good. So it was just an enjoyment of the goodness of his creation with human beings as the crown of his creation, and the sense of being still in that space. And this is the discipline of Sabbath, and I think this is a good place, to finish, because I think for us recovering the principle of Sabbath, not just as a day a week. For me, actually, a day a week is important to do that. I mean, but there are a number of different ways we can do that. I mean, traditionally putting that day aside for worship, to worship with other people, because this is not just a solitary thing. One of the ways in which I think we can recover these contemplative spaces is to do it together, actually, and create, times where we get together and we worship, and whether we feel like it or not is not even relevant. It's exercising this different ways of knowing and seeking and reaching and out to God and doing this. So it's creating spaces for that. It's creating spaces where I can just, even through the day, go for a, as you say, go for a walk, take the headphones out. When you're driving in the car, turn the radio off. Just inhabit little blocks of silence more and more and more. And do things that slow you down, not that speed up your mind. A lot of the media that we expose it to just speeds up our minds. It doesn't slow our minds down. Reflecting on, so in my time, I tried to do things that slowed me down. I read parts of scripture slowly. I tried to, even read things that would slow my mind down a little bit, or go for walks, sit in empty space. It's so countercultural. It's so countercultural, but it's so necessary for us learning to be present and create space in which to actually become more porous to what is beautiful and sublime and glorious, and ultimately a space that God inhabits.
Hi listeners, we have posted a video of the double-axis worldview chart that we refer to through this perspective series. You'll find the link in the podcast notes for this episode, or as a link on the latest Thrive Perspectives episode at our website, thrivetoday.tv.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Thrive Perspectives. Our hope is that these discussions will challenge you to look at life from a new perspective. You'll find all our resources at the Thrive Today website, thrivetoday.tv.